Shout out to G-Man Boxing.
Alright people, thanks for dropping by the channel. If you could, hit subscribe on the way in, hit the like button, help your boy out. As always, this video is sponsored by the Hit Company. Thank you very much for being on board. This year I wanted to do, because people love these and they always ask me for them, so I said I'll do some more career reviews. Obviously I don't call them career reviews, I call them WTF, you know, what happened or what's the deal. And who better to do it with than Tony Bellew. Now, as many of you will know, Tony Bellew as a pundit, really as a person, he leaves a lot to be desired. However, on this channel, I've always said that I judge them what they do in the ring. They can be whatever as a person, but in the ring, I'll always give them their due and give them their praise if it's due. And vice versa, if I like the fighter as a person, if they do so. A good example, Josh Taylor. I quite like Josh Taylor, but no way in hell he beat Jack Catterall. And him being as adamant as he is that he beat him is laughable. And the way he's been dragging this rematch out is just silly. And Sergey Kovalev. Don't like Sergey Kovalev at all as a person. Horrible person. But he was one of my favourite fighters to watch in his prime. He was brilliant. He was tremendous. Just such a... He really was a joy to watch. And Bellew, his career, in the nicest way, and I'm sure he would acknowledge this as well, you could sum it up as saying he was an overachiever. Because he really was. Now, we'll delve into his career, his CV now in a sec. We'll also look at his amateur record, but when you look at how he started and kind of where he was come 2011, 2013, to say that he would go on to have the career he did, win a title at cruiserweight, beat David Haye at heavyweight, and finish it, you know, by having a fight with Alexander Usyk, in a fight where he done well in the early half, you'd probably say after the first Cleverly fight, that was unlikely. Well, we'll look at his CV, we'll talk about the start, the midpoint and the end, and we'll ask the question, what the fuck happened to Tony Bellew? Now, Tony Bellew did have a decent enough amateur career, although, saying that, BoxRec, as they so often do, I think they only tend, when you're at a certain level, or if you're kind of more senior, they tend to only put those fights on BoxRec. So if you look at Tony Bellew's BoxRec, it says he only had 10 amateur fights. He obviously had a lot more than that. I believe in 05, so he was an amateur until 07. I believe it was 05, maybe 05 or 06. He actually sparred David Haye up with David Price. And Tony Bellew, throughout his amateur career, he was competing at heavyweight. So heavyweight as an amateur is 200 pounds. Actually, it's 201 pounds as an amateur. It's a pound heavier than the pros. So it's essentially in the pros, it's cruiserweight. So he was competing at that. Now, if you look at the fights that BoxRec have listed, there's only one name here, and it was a name, and he did win this fight, that jumps out at you, which is Artur Szpilka. He fought him in February 2007, beat him on points. Now, Bellew was known for having quite good punching power as an amateur, and you'll see RSC, TKO, and a KO of John Lewis Dickinson. His name rings a bell. Yeah, John Lewis Dickinson, he won prize fighter. Didn't do much as a pro, but Tony Bellew beat him as an amateur, and it was a clean KO. It was a clean KO in the second round. Doesn't give a great amount of detail, but it was an English national ABA final at heavyweight, 91 kg, which is heavyweight. So Tony Bellew, as an amateur, certainly he showed that he had a lot of power. Now, he turned pro in October of 2007. So Bellew, when he turned over pro, two things. One, he turned pro at 175 pounds. Now, cruiserweight is kind of that. It's a weird one. So cruiserweight, it's a 25 jump from from light heavy to cruiser. So it's a big gap. So to jump up that is one thing, but to come down it, that's tough. And Bellew, probably in hindsight, will probably tell you that it was a mistake. And it probably was, looking back realistically. He should have just stayed at cruiserweight. I mean, I think if you were to say you boxed at light heavyweight as an amateur and you turn pro at super middle, that's not something you'd really raise an eyebrow to be honest with you. You'd probably say, okay, fair enough. But to be at heavyweight, to go down to light heavy as an amateur, it is a bit of a it was an ask. Now, he turned pro with Frank Warren. His debut was actually in Nottingham. This was on the undercard. I believe it was on an Amir Khan undercard. Yeah, it was. Amir Khan versus Scott Lawton. Now, it's funny, right? When you look at some of these old undercards, the names you see on them, you actually look and you just think, wow, these actually shared an undercard. So I just named for you who was on the undercard. Obviously, Bellew was on this undercard. This was a Commonwealth title for Amir Khan. Anthony Crolla was on the undercard. I think Crolla was 5-0 at the time. A certain Mr. Kell Brook was also on that undercard, believe it or not. So Frank Warren straight off the back getting Bellew out. Now, we had him out the following month, and this was an even bigger event. This was at the Principality Stadium. This was on the undercard of Calzaghe Kessler. You had names like Jamie Cox, Ricky Burns, Nathan Cleverly, Enzo Macronelli, and obviously we know Joe Calzaghe. So Bellew's pro debut was against a guy called Jamie Ambler, right, who was 3-10, and this guy was a guy called Adam Wilcox, who was 1. He literally one fight, lost it. Bellew stopped him in 3 rounds. The Bellew, I'd really want to say for the first, you could probably argue for the first 3 years of his career. I mean, if you look at the first 3 years of Bellew's career, he fought 4-rounders up until basically 2009. And in 2009, he had a couple of 6-rounders, a couple of 10-rounders, or 8-rounders. Never had any 10-rounders, just straight into 12-rounders. So let's look at some of the names he fought here. He fought Wayne Brooks, who was 0-3. That was in Bolton. That was on another Can undercard. Paul Bonson, a durable journeyman, it has to be said. This guy, 92 losses, ended with 105 losses, only stopped 3 times. This was a 4-rounder. Bellew was 184 pounds for that fight. That was on the undercard of Derry Matthews versus Chio Tesprafui. Amir Khan fought on that card as well. So did Anthony Crolla. Anthony Crolla lost that fight actually on there. And again, another 4-rounder. So for the first year and a bit of his career, he was fighting guys who he was meant to beat. Guys like this guy, Paul Goodwin, 4-1. This guy, Matthew Ellis. That name rings a bell, actually, Matthew Ellis. And that was on the undercard of Martin Rogan versus Sam Sexton. So Frank Warren was getting them out on all these cards. That actually had Frankie Gavin, Billy Joe Saunders, and James DeGale on it. It's crazy when you look at some of these old cards. You look at some of the old undercards and you see just the names and you just think, wow, look what he went on to do, look what he went on to do. And, just go a little bit off topic here. Some people have argued that we're going into a bit of a dark age. And I don't know if necessarily a dark age would be the word I'd use. But when you see how many fights were on these old undercards, like some of these undercards had like 10 and 12 fights on them. And the names you see on there, what they went on to do, you don't really tend to see that nowadays. That's not to say it can't happen, but you don't really tend to see as much of it nowadays. So, again, Bellew, in his pro career, now I think he said at the start of his pro career he was juggling work and boxing, and obviously he was fighting with Frank Warren. This was at a time, 07 to probably around about end of 2011, 2012, where British boxing, there wasn't much going for it. So a lot of these shows, Calzaghe had gone off to America at that point, and there was Carl Froch was kind of only starting to come into his own. There was obviously no Joshua, no Fury. There wasn't really any names there. And a lot of these shows, the Frank Warren shows, the Mick Hennessy was putting on a few shows, Frank Maloney was as well. Frank Warren was the main guy. Eddie Hearn hadn't taken over matchroom from Barry. Barry was putting on shows now and again. So it was all really kind of Frank Warren. But Frank Warren didn't really have a massive stable. I mean, I know it's easy to look at the fights Bellew was in and say, oh, he had DeGale on the undercard, Saunders, he had, Kell Brook, Amir Khan. Yeah, but these were not the names they go on to be at this time. These were just kind of the prospects, the Ben Whitakers, the Adam Azims of their day at the time. So these were the cards Bellew was fighting on. And again, his first year, it was only just 4 rounders. Well, it was only 4 rounders up until 09. He had his first 6-rounder against Matthew Ellis, as I said. Nick Oka. I think I remember, was that on Sky? No, it wasn't. There was definitely a fight, one of Bellew's early fights, I remember that was on Sky that I remember well watching. I can't remember which one it was, though. But he went on to have his, his 6-rounders, his 8-rounders. And again, just going through the motions, his first 12-rounder was... I'm amazed this was actually scheduled for 12 rounds. It was actually for a Commonwealth title, believe it or not. The light heavyweight Commonwealth title. It was in the Echo Arena. See who's undercard. It was on one of Kell Brook's undercards. Paul Smith fought on there. Enzo Macronelli, Stephen Smith, Liam Smith. I don't think Callum had turned pro yet, so all the Smith brothers were fighting on this card. And yeah, I think that it was on Sky Sports. That was on the 12th of March 2010, Echo Arena. And he fought a guy called Atlee Moore, this might be the fight actually. Bellew knocked him out in a round, but amazingly, like, I don't know how he was able to get a Commonwealth title crack. He was 4-1. And what did he finish his career with? 13-4. He was a Ghanaian. He finished his career. He was 5'6" as well. Jesus Christ. Lost to Habib Ahmed. I know him. He's fought for a world title. He got beat by Ramirez a couple of years ago. Bellew. He literally fought nobody. And the only fight he had fought where the guy had a winning record, he lost. So somehow he got a Commonwealth title crack. Then Bellew had to defend that title against Bob Ajisafi, who was 8-1. Now, this was the first real crisis of Bellew's career. And I guess you could say it was at this point you realised light heavyweight was not the place for you. Because Bellew, Bob Ajisafi, I think going into this fight, he only had about 2 knockouts, if memory serves me correct, because Ajisafi, he finished his career with 19 wins, 9 knockouts and 4 losses, never stopped, right? He was one of those guys where he was one of those fighters who had underrated punching power, is the best way to describe it. Bob Ajisafi, for people who've actually fought him, have all said the same. Tremendous puncher, big hitter, but to look at his record, especially going into this fight, I think he only had like 1 or 2 knockouts. He certainly didn't appear to have that kind of power. Well, he had Bellew down in the 4th round, and he Bellew hurt. Now, Bellew, in his career, especially at light heavyweight, he had a tendency to get dropped. He did. He was dropped in this fight. But one thing you'll say about Bellew, for the most part, there have been exceptions, of course, but for the most part, he was able to recover quite quickly. He was able to recover in this fight. It went the distance. Now, he won this fight. 2 of the scorecards were quite wide. I remember this fight. I remember at the time, Bellew, he did win it, but it was Ajisafi had his moments. The 115-114 scorecard is fair. The 117-111 scorecard to Bellew was a bit wide, but Bellew won that fight, and that was, he main evented that fight. There was only 4 fights on that card, which is strange. And then he had another crisis, and this next one was a real crisis against Ovil McKenzie. This was 3 months later. This again was at the Echo Arena. Paul Smith got beat by De Gale. Nathan Cleverly defended his interim title against Nabib Mohammed. Who else fought on this card? Kell Brook, Matthew Macklin, Liam Smith, Paul Butler, Joe McNally, the trainer, and Billy Joe Saunders. All those. Larry Olabamiwo. Jesus, it's mad to see just all the names, and you just think, well, he's retired, look what he's done this. It's crazy when you look back. But Ovil McKenzie, the upsetter. Ovil McKenzie, tremendous fighter in his day. He always came to win. Unlucky not to become world champion in Argentina back in 2000, I think it was 14 or 15. Unlucky there. He had Bellew down in rounds 1 and 2. And, Bellew, credit to him, was able to recover. He actually was able to drop Ovil McKenzie with a left in the 8th. I was able to take him out. But, of course, fight was good. Rematch was called. Bellew, actually the British title was on the line in the rematch. Bellew was able to win it, boxed well, and was able to win that just on point. Thankfully, for his sake, no knockdowns in this fight, again at the Echo Arena. And again, I find it interesting just seeing the names on some of these cards. Callum Johnson, Paul Butler, Rocky Field and Frankie Gavin, Ricky Burns, all the names. So at that point, Bellew had done pretty well for himself, it has to be said. He turned pro in 2007. It's now 2011, July 2011. So he'd have been pro for just under 4 years. He's picked up a British title. He's also picked up a Commonwealth title. He was fighting still with Frank Warren. All right. He wasn't making crazy sums of money, to be fair, because as I said, at this time in British boxing, it wasn't. It was kind of at this time where David Haye, I think he just lost to Klitschko, and he was the kind of big name. They'd have that debacle, the Audley Harrison fight. Froch was either getting ready or was about to fight, or had just fought Andre Ward. So it was kind of, we were getting there. We were getting kind of into a stage in British boxing where things were starting to improve. And obviously we know what happened, kind of 2014 onwards. It was good stuff. So his next fight was going to be at the Echo Arena. It was going to be against Nathan Cleverly for the WBO light heavyweight world title. That was obviously a title Nathan Cleverly had. And these two guys were going to fight. It was the main event. James DeGale fought in the undercard, as did Billy Joe Saunders, Paul Butler, Liam Smith, and Rocky Fielding, just to name a few. Now, this fight was, they had 2 fights, and this fight was the best of the 2. Still wasn't a great fight, but it was an okay fight. Nathan Cleverly won on points. He pretty much just outworked Tony Bellew. It was a majority decision. Bellew always claims, and it's one of those things where I wouldn't doubt this one, that at that point, and look, I'd say probably after Bob Ajasafi, he should have moved up, that at that point, the weight was becoming a bit of a chore. Well, he stayed at light heavy for another 2 years, and we'll talk about what went on after. But he made his comeback after that loss and defended his British title. Obviously, he still had that against Danny McIntosh. Stopped him in 5 rounds, had him down a couple of times. There's no real names on the undercard other than Jose Burton that I really recognised. This was in 2012, and I think this was this his first fight? Yeah, this would have been his first fight with Matchroom. So Dave Colwell co-promoted with Eddie Hearn. Now, I think this would have been around about the time where Bellew was having issues with Frank Warren. So obviously he wanted to get rid of Frank Warren as promoter, and he wanted to go and sign with Eddie Hearn. And he's obviously done that, but Warren is not the easiest to work with. And I remember Bellew very clearly talking about, I want to be careful with how I word this, having issues, and Dave Colwell being very good, because obviously Dave Colwell was not just a trainer, he was obviously promoting as well at this time. Obviously co-promoted that with David Haye, and obviously Dave Colwell very close to Tony Bellew. He wasn't always his trainer. I think he was second in the corner for a while actually before finally taking over the reins. He gave Bellew money, which helped him on his way, so to speak. We kind of know what kind of guy Frank Warren is, and that was his first fight with Eddie Hearn. Then he had a fight against Edison Miranda. Now Miranda, tremendous puncher. This was for a WBC International Light Heavyweight title, and this was at the Alexandra Palace in London. Was this the Alexandra Ali Pali in London? I know Eddie Hearn did put a few on there, but I'm not sure if that was the one. But he ended up stopping Edison Miranda, who'd seen better days, it's fair to say, at this point. Stopped him in the 9th round. Bellew was getting a high enough ranking with the WBC. Fought Robert Falcone Ballanti. Now, this was an okay fight, but Bellew, he dropped him a couple of times, dropped Ballanti a couple of times, and just, it was what it was. It was a shutout win. So picked up the WBC silver title. Now, I believe this was an eliminator, this next fight, against Isaac Chilemba, where it wasn't a great fight. Bellew got a draw, and obviously a rematch was called. Now, the rematch with Chilemba really wasn't a great fight. This was at the O2. I wonder what undercard this was on. This was on the undercard of Carl Froch, Mikhail Kessler. In fact, I think it might have even been the co-main. I think it might have been that, actually. Really wasn't a great fight, the Chilemba rematch, but he got the job done, which meant then that he would then be going on to challenge for world honours yet again. So we get a second bite at the cherry for a shot at the light heavyweight world title. Wouldn't be against Nathan Cleverly. Nathan Cleverly had lost his WBO title, and Bellew had been fighting for international WBC titles and silver titles. So he was going to get a crack at their champion, Adonis Superman Stevenson. Now, Stevenson, at one point actually, I think it was 2012, was number 1 contender. He was mandated by the IBF to fight Carl Froch at 168 pounds. He actually chose to go up to 175 to take on then reigning champion Chad Dawson. Now, Dawson was 1 fight removed from fighting Andre Ward at 168 pounds, where he did not look right at all. And apparently, I think it was Edison Miranda actually who knocked him out in sparring only a week or 2 weeks prior, correct me if I'm wrong on that, to Chad Dawson fighting Andre Ward, which is one of the reasons why he looked so, well, I suppose the weight didn't help as well. One of the reasons why he looked so kind of out of place in that fight against Ward, it was stopped, I think, at 10 rounds. Goes in there, his next fight, still light heavyweight champion, fights Adonis Stevenson, gets knocked out in a round. Stevenson, one of the best left hands in the game at the time, tremendous puncher with the left hand, and that was a younger Stevenson, he had his speed then. So Stevenson, this fight was going to happen in Canada, and it was on HBO. Sergey Kovalev fought Ishmael Sala on the undercard. Kevin Bizier fought Jojo Dan. Amazingly, both those guys, Kevin Bizier and Jojo Dan, would be, I think one of them, if not both, were mandated for Kell Brook at 147 pounds. Both guys were absolutely garbage, shouldn't have been in the ring with him. You also had Lemieux on the undercard. Beterbiev, how many fights in was this for Beterbiev? And of course it was a KO against Billy Bailey. How many fights? This was his 3rd pro fight. Artur Beterbiev had his 3rd pro fight on this card. This was obviously in Montreal, it was in Quebec City. Just want to see Quebec, I just think Montreal. Adonis Steve, like, at this point, Bellew should have, as I said, moved up from light heavyweight. 3 years prior, he was still. I guess obviously he could see a world title fight in the future, in the immediate, and obviously decided to keep going at 175 pounds just to see how it would go. But you could tell not only was he just Adonis Stevenson was the superior. You know, Bellew was 6'3", and as much as he tried to fight on the outside, Adonis Stevenson, although Stevenson is only 5'11", Bellew 6'3", Adonis Stevenson has really like octopus-like arms. They're crazy, like Dr. Octopus, you know, type things. They're crazy. So he was able to just completely shut Bellew down from range. He would hit him wherever he could with that left hand, and it really deterred Bellew. And then obviously, Bellew did have his moment. I think it was the 4th round where some people felt that it should have been called a knockdown. If you go back and look at it, so Bellew kind of comes in with his forearm, and it kind of almost pushes Adonis Stevenson in the back of the head down. Stevenson goes down. He wasn't devastatingly hurt, and the referee, Michael Griffin, who normally would referee up in Canada, he actually refereed Joshua versus Ruiz, the first fight, and he basically called it no knockdown. And look, if you look at the replays, he was right to be fair, he was right not to call it a knockdown, because it was more like a forearm just pushing him down on the head, something like that. So that was Bellew's kind of moment of success. That was the only moment of success he had in the fight, because he even said he expected to be behind on the scorecards, but he was never able to mount any offense. He was intimidated by Adonis Stevenson's power. And then in the 6th round, have a look there on screen.
Don't count me out early on. So now he's tasted the canvas, and he's going to get it stopped right here. That will do it. Bellew was
Bellew gets taken out in the 6th round in a fight in which he was never really competitive in. So at that point, it was just a case of move straight up to 100 or to 200 pounds, move up to cruiserweight. And no sooner had he moved to the cruiserweight, obviously Nathan Cleverly had just lost against Sergey Kovalev. He was going to go and move up, but he was promoted by Eddie Hearn as well at the time. He decided, okay, I'm going to move up to 200 pounds as well. So it seemed like naturally they were on a collision course. But obviously Eddie Hearn didn't want to get that fight over the line straight away. He obviously wanted to get both guys settled at the weight. So Bellew would have his first fight at cruiserweight since he's turned pro, because all his fights have been at light heavyweight, on the 15th of March 2014 against Valery Bordov. Now, I don't believe at the time Bordov was stopped. No, he was actually. He was stopped. I know he fought someone at cruiserweight who hadn't been stopped at the time. Now, he fought this guy, stopped him in the 12th round. It was an injury that stopped him, but Bellew floored him a couple of times prior to that. I think he floored him about 2 or 3 times prior to the final stoppage. So that was Bellew, and he weighed 197 pounds. So that just goes to show how much weight he was cutting, because cruiserweight is an interesting one. It's kind of one of those, it's a big jump. So from super middle to light heavy, it's 7 pounds. From light heavy to cruiser, it's 25 pounds. So you could be a fighter where you could find yourself kind of damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you're not fully like there in terms of filling out for cruiser, you could find yourself in a situation where your body just cannot make light heavy anymore. It's becoming too much of a chore. Maybe you've got denser bones, I don't know, for whatever reason it's a chore. But you know, without having to, you know, unnaturally pump yourself full of weights to get up to 200 pounds, you could only be maybe 190, say 1 pounds, and that's probably the max your body could really get to. That's not enough for the most part at cruiserweight, especially considering the fact you probably wouldn't even be cutting any weight. You know, most of them guys are coming in, you know, on fight night 210, 215 pounds. You'd be giving up a hell of a lot of weight. So for a lot of guys moving up to that weight, it can be tough. And a lot of guys who fight a cruiser, they can just be in a kind of vicious circle where it's like, I know I'm not big enough, I know these guys ragdoll me, but I cannot physically get down to 175 pounds, safely anyway. But Bellew fit into the weight perfectly. seemed to actually suit him fine. And it was this fight here, Julio Cesar dos Santos. Now, dos Santos has been stopped before. I mean, he's been stopped in his last 4 fights. His last fight was in 2018, but prior to that, against Bellew, he'd never been stopped. It was a big left hook that knocked him out. That was in the Echo Arena. I think he headlined that fight. That was on Sky Sports. Cleverly fought on the undercard, as did Fielding, as did Callum Smith, Liam Smith. Joshua actually fought Matt Skelton on the undercard. Anthony Ogogo. Oh, Jesus. There's the name we don't want to remember. Luke Campbell and Gamal Yafai. Tommy Martin as well. Tommy Martin, I think, is that the Tommy Martin who had to retire, sadly, because he had a serious injury after a fight once? I think that might have been him. And obviously then after, it was going to be Cleverly versus Bellew, November 2014. Almost a year, literally almost a year to the day after his loss to Stevenson, he would fight at the Echo Arena. He would fight Nathan Cleverly. Now, I have to say, right, this fight here was on pay-per-view. This fight here was a pay-per-view event. Yes, it was a pay-per-view. You heard me correctly, a pay-per-view event. Should it have been a pay-per-view event? Hell no. This really was one of the worst pay-per-views and just completely unjustifiable pay-per-views I think Sky and Eddie Hearn have ever done. Bear in mind, I think the original plan for this fight, bear in mind that this was a headline act on a pay-per-view. I think the original plan, if memory serves me correct, I'm not very much mistaken, was for Bellew and Cleverly to be the co-main event on a Kell Brook defence. I'm not sure if that was going to be pay-per-view or not. I think it might have been. I think they were planning on doing the Frankie Gavin fight earlier. But imagine that, like a co-main, now you're going to put it on pay-per-view. I mean, that was reaching. Now, some people said, well, at the time, you had, names on it. These names were not big names at the time. Like, you had Joshua fight Michael Sprott. That was Joshua's 10 pro fight. Jamie McDonnell, again, was nowhere. George Groves against Dennis Douglin. But George Groves, that was, I think, his first, maybe his second fight after the Carl Froch fight. Callum Smith, again, was still an up-and-comer. Scott Quigg, up-and-comer. James DeGale, up-and-comer. And they were all in complete mismatches. Like, literally, this was a case of everyone on the left won. So there was no one on the away corner who won. So it was not a good event. It really wasn't. And you could have given it a bit of a pass, maybe, if the fight had been, one of those real, big entertaining fights. It wasn't even that. Like, the fight wasn't great at all. Nathan Cleverly was just so reluctant to throw his right hand. Bellew just did what he wanted to do from the outside, and he won this fight pretty convincingly. I know the scorecards, one of the scorecards there, well, two of them, 115, 140. That was actually split decision. I forgot about that, actually. Someone gave it to Cleverly. Terry O'Connor, it would be him, gave it to Cleverly, and Howard Foster had it close to Bellew. It wasn't that type of fight. Bellew won it pretty clearly. It was just a real stinker. The less said about that fight, the better. And to be honest with you, I think it hurt Tony Bellew's stock. I do. I think the whole card, I think that whole event just hurt Bellew and Cleverly's stock, because both of them went from headline and pay-per-views to being quite low down the card on their next fight. So, like, Bellew fought a guy in a 10-rounder in his next fight, which was a guy who was Ivan Barinchin, who was 22-7. That was at the Echo Arena, and this was on, I think, was on a Callum Smith undercard. So imagine that. Imagine you've gone from fighting a guy on pay-per-view to fighting low down the card, and his next fight after that in September was only an 8-rounder. And what card? I think that might have been, that was in Leeds. That was on a Josh Warrington card. I didn't even need to know it was Josh. As soon as I saw Leeds, I was like, that's Josh Warrington. So bear in mind, like, Eddie Hearn put these guys on pay-per-view, and now he's fighting way down a card in Leeds, which is kind of like, again, that pay-per-view was just so not justified. I'm not going to have a rant about it, but it really wasn't. But then Bellew had a crack at the European title, and this would be on pay-per-view, but he wouldn't be headlining, of course. This was on the undercard of Dylan White versus Anthony Joshua. Now, he fought Mastanek. Very close fight up until the 12th round. And Bellew hurt Mastanek. And this was a good win. This win's aged pretty well, it has to be said. It was for European title as well. Bellew never won that at light heavy, so he was able to pick that up. Bellew won it 5-7 on all three judges' scorecards. There was a 10-8 round by two judges in the 12th round, because he was literally this much. He was a punch or two away from at the very least dropping Mastanek, but I think he would have took him out. And that was a good performance. This then, I'm not sure if Bellew was mad. I don't think he was. I think he was highly ranked by the WBC, but I think Makabu, in fact, definitely, I'm pretty sure Makabu was mandatory for Gregory Draws at the time. So Gregory Draws, for those who don't know, he's a Russian fighter. I think he was known as the Pretty Boy. But he only had one loss. I forget who beat him. I can't remember who beat him. Might have been Steve Cunningham. Can't remember who beat him. Or Marco Huck, one or the other. But he'd won that WBC title. He'd had to vacate it due to an injury, and the injury... Well, actually, I think he was interim. I think there was an interim title because he was injured, but then he never fought again. So the title became vacant. So Ilunga Makabu, who had just actually beaten Thabisa Mchunu in South Africa, was going to fight for the vacant title, and Tony Bellew, I believe he was highly ranked. I'm not sure if he was next in line, but he was up there. Would end up fighting him for the vacant title. They were going to meet at Goodison Park. I believe this was on a bank holiday weekend in the UK, because this I remember. They had Ricky Burns on Saturday night fighting some Italian guy for a £140 title, WBA title at 140. I can't remember the Italian guy's name. And the next night, I think that was up in Scotland. And then the next night was a Sunday, and it was going to be Goodison Park. Because I believe 29th of May is a bank holiday weekend in the UK. So they had this fight at Goodison Park. I don't remember much about the undercard. I remember David Price fought on the undercard, and that was his comeback fight. Callum Smith fought on it. James Metcalf. Jesus. It's Price he fought on there. Yeah, I don't remember much about the undercard, truth be told. I really don't. But I remember the main fight. Now, going into this fight, I thought Bellew would beat Makabu, but I thought he beat him on points. I thought Makabu... He showed some decent whiskers against Thabisa Mchunu because he was getting lit up in that fight, the first fight that they had. He was able to pull it out late. He could punch, and I kind of thought Bellew would be a bit cautious with Makabu, and he'd probably just look to outbox him, because Makabu is quite small for a cruiserweight. He was only about 5'10", and unlike Adonis Stevenson, he didn't have the levers that Stevenson had. So I kind of thought Bellew would keep it long, he'd keep it at distance, and he'd just pick up the win like that. Well, Bellew in the first round looked brilliant until about the last 10 seconds when he got caught with a silly left hand. He wasn't even so much hurt. I think he might have broke his nose as well, that left hand, because I think his nose was bleeding a bit. And he just went down. He kind of rolled himself back up and straight back up again. And Dave Colwell, who at this time now was doing the corner for Tony Bellew, I think the words he used were, "You got greedy," because he was having so much success in that first round. I think he buzzed Makabu a few times. And he just ended up getting caught with a silly shot. Gave that round to Makabu. Recovered in the second round pretty well. And then obviously in the third round, I mean, you'll see on screen just there, was a big knockout. One of Bellew's biggest knockouts, truth be told. And he was able to lay Makabu out. Looking back with the benefit of hindsight, I don't think Makabu was lost since then. In fact, I'm pretty sure, no, he hasn't lost since then. And that win, you know, say what you want to say about Tony Bellew, but that win against Makabu aged brilliantly. The loss against Stevenson didn't age too bad, because Stevenson done some good things at light heavy. So when you look at his Bellew in the grand scheme of things, or you look at his resume in the grand scheme of things, it's not a bad little resume. So Makabu went on to become cruiserweight champion. He beat Mchunu again. He beat Kudryashov. He beat that Russian fighter's name, who, it's not Seslak. It's a different guy. What's his name? I'll get his on box rec here. That was a good fight as well. Or was it Seslak? Oh yeah, it was Seslak actually. It was Alex Papin. That's who I was thinking of as well. So he beat Seslak, he beat Papin, he beat Ola Duradola, who's seen better days. Now he's fighting Badu Jack. And if you look at his resume, it's not a bad little resume, to be fair, from Ilunga Makabu. You know, potentially could have a Canelo fight, you never know, if he gets by Badu Jack. Because remember, Canelo was talking about fighting him. So that win has really aged well for Tony Bellew. He had his first title defence against BJ Flores. Now, BJ Flores looked absolutely dead on the scales, because prior to this fight, he was fighting up a heavyweight. I think his last fight, a heavyweight, he was like 225 or something like that. So he was cutting a lot of weight to get down to cruiserweight. He looked horrible on the scales. And in the fight, the referee in that fight was Ian John Lewis. Ian John Lewis, I've always said, he's not a bad referee, but when he has his bad moments, they're flipping bad. You know, look at Shannon Briggs versus Vitaly Klitschko. When he has his bad moments, they're big. So he missed a low blow in the third round, and BJ Flores complained, was actually hit by, I think it was a left hook by Bellew, went down, and Bellew put him down a couple of times thereafter. BJ Flores was a good friend of David Hayes. Now, when Tony Bellew beat Ilunga Makabu, he did that famous call out where he called out Fish Eyes. We all know who that is. And just for him to, that's one thing I'll give Bellew credit for. You know, he had good, back then he had a lot more banter than he does now. You know, the banter now with Bellew was just non-existent. Back then, when he was animated, he had some good banter. I mean, Colin Frank, well, we know who we're talking about. Colin Fish Eyes, that was on live TV. That was brilliant. That was just I'll always give him credit for that. That was tremendous. It really was. He called out Lebedev. Lebedev fight never happened. And obviously you mentioned David Haye. I think David Haye at the time, I can't remember where the beef stemmed from. But there was definitely beef coming from those two guys. I think David Haye might have called Bellew out at one point or something like that. I'm not sure the ins and outs. But basically them two guys weren't happy. And Bellew, I kind of missed, like, this Bellew was a lot more likeable back then. I felt. It was kind of after the David Haye fight he became a lot less likeable. But when he beat BJ Flores, he went straight at ringside and called David Haye out. And I mean, he was not playing around with that call out, saying, you know, what was it, a sideshow bob haircut and stuff like that. It was hilarious. You could tell David Haye was kind of, you know, David Haye was on the comeback trail at this stage. He was kind of just thinking it was all a bit kind of fun and games. But yeah, Bellew wasn't playing. And David Haye, when he came back, you know, he had Briggs calling him out. Looking back with hindsight, that Briggs fight, if it did have happened, I know you could look and say, gee, really, Briggs? Look, David Haye's body was absolutely shot to pieces. David Haye couldn't get through, couldn't even fight at a decent pace in any fight without doing an injury. I know Briggs would be dangerous for a round or two. You wouldn't know what happened. I think with Bellew, it was an easier, probably David Haye was like, right, I can fight Briggs and I should win, but if I don't, I'm screwed. At least with Bellew, I should win. That's what he thought. I thought he'd win as well. But at least if I lose, I've lost to a current cruiserweight champion. It's not as bad as losing to a 40-something-year-old Shannon Briggs saying, let's go, champ. So he ended up fighting Tony Bellew. The fight was announced. Well ahead of time. Like, I think this fight was announced, in November? I think it was announced in November 2016. In fact, it definitely was announced in November 2016. And it was going to be in the O2 Arena, but it wasn't going to take place until March the 4th, 2017. Now, I remember going into this fight, Bellew had never fought a heavyweight. He'd never fought north of 200 pounds at all, really. I don't think he'd ever even weighed north of 200 pounds either. So I didn't realise. I knew David Haye didn't look the same as he used to. I knew this wasn't the David Haye who fought Bellew, the David Haye who fought Jean-Marc Mormec, the David Haye who fought John Ruiz. I knew he didn't have that David Haye. But how far gone was he? You know, we'd only seen him fight Mark Demori, blew him out in a round. Arnold Jajai, who was garbage, blew him out in a few rounds. We hadn't seen David Haye in there with anyone with a pulse. So we kind of didn't know what to assess with David Haye. I just looked at it from a stylistic point of view and I thought David Haye uses his reach, likes to sharpshoot, big right hand, pretty much the orthodox version of Adonis Stevenson. Bellew ain't winning this fight. That's what I thought going into this fight. That's genuinely what I thought. And in this fight, it looked that way inclined. You know, Bellew had a good first round, he did, but David Haye took over. He took over, and then came the 6th round where David Haye ruptured his Achilles. He went down and somehow, amazingly, was able to actually fight on until the 11th round. Even more amazingly, I think it was either the 8th round or the 9th round. Go and look at the first David Haye-Tony Bellew fight. It was either the 8th round or the 9th round. David Haye won that round. He actually won a round with a ruptured Achilles. Now, they might not have given it to him. I think they might have actually. But he won a round with a ruptured Achilles. Because Tony Bellew was super cautious. David Haye was always a tremendous puncher. And Bellew was super cautious about getting hit by David Haye. Because he knew, look, this guy could knock me spark out. In the 11th round, Bellew put the pressure on David Haye. That was it. That was all she wrote. He got David Haye out of there. Shane McGuigan threw in the towel. And Bellew got the biggest win, arguably, of his career. He then, obviously, had to rematch David Haye. Now, the rematch didn't happen until May 2018. Few reasons for that. One, it was actually meant to happen. I think it was the 18th of December. I think it was going to be on a Sunday. 2017 was the original date they were given for this fight to take place. They announced it. Eddie Hearn said, yep, it's got to take place on a Sunday, O2 Arena, pay-per-view, etc., all that good stuff. David Haye apparently, he was on a stair machine or something like that, and I think he hurt his body. I don't know how he did it, but this is just that David Haye's body was falling to pieces. I think he said it was a bicep injury that he got from a stair machine that he was on. Don't ask me. I think that's how it was. Don't ask me the ins and outs. David Haye's body at that stage was just like, you know, a little stick you could snap. That was literally probably what it was like at the time. Probably still is now. David Haye's body was in a bad way. So that fight didn't happen in the end of 2017. It got pushed back to 2018. May the 5th, 2018. Bellew against Haye again. Haye came in lighter, as too did Bellew, and it was repeat. Can't remember the undercard. Oh yeah, Paul Butler, Martin J. Ward, John Ryder, Lenroy Thomas got battered by Joe Joyce. Remember that fight? Monty Powell the Fourth. I remember hearing about him once and I've never heard of him since. I think he was literally the only time I heard of him was on that card. David Haye, Tony Bellew. Fight happened again. I picked David Haye again for my ignorance. And again, David Haye got beat. Pretty convincingly, pretty clearly. Bellew beat him even more decisively this time. It was pretty damn easy. It was pretty damn easy for Tony Bellew in this fight. David Haye won the first 2 rounds, but once David Haye tried to attack again, it was over pretty quick. He had him down once in the third, I should say, and then again in the 5th. Referee Howard Foster waved it off. So at that point, Bellew was seriously talking about retirement. He was thinking about it. He was talking about it. He was hinting at it. And he said himself he would have called it quits at that point, had it not been for Alexander Usyk winning the World Boxing Super Series and mentioning Tony Bellew. Tony Bellew said to Eddie Hearn, get me that fight. He wanted to be undisputed cruiserweight champion. He was actually champion emeritus with the WBC at this stage because he moved up to heavyweight, so it meant that he could go back down to cruiser, get an immediate crack at the champion, which was Alexander Usyk at the time. He was undisputed. So what happened? Well, of course, these guys met. It was November 10th. I remember the date very well. Manchester Arena. This fight, that whole card wasn't too shabby, actually, if I remember correctly. That whole card, the Anthony Crolla fight was a bit, but the rest of the card was actually pretty good. And they met, MEN, 2018. Bellew started the fight very well. It has to be said. Was it more so Bellew starting it well, or was it Usyk starting slow? Because Usyk barely did anything in the first round. And I think with Usyk, it was just a case of him, right, seeing what Bellew has, working out the angles, maybe a bit more confusing with Bellew than he was with some of the other fighters. You know, Garcia, a bit more flat-footed than Bellew, was easier for Alexander Usyk. And anyway, once he found out the angles, he was having a lot more success. He was buzzing Bellew now and again with the left hand. And obviously the 8th round happened. We all know what happened. On screen just there, you'll see it. The big big left hand from Tony Bellew. That was our big left hand from Tony Bellew, big left hand from Alexander Usyk. That was all she wrote. Bellew was done. And at that point, that was it. Bellew said the famous words, "You'll never see me again, Cougs." Ha 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 ha. Yes, really, that turned out to be a big fat lie. But that was the end of Bellew's career. He called it quits at that point. And if we look, as I said at the start of this video, look, I'm not going to have a go. I'm not even going to mention Bellew, the person. I'm just going to talk about Bellew, the fighter. 30 wins, 3 defeats, and 1 draw. It's a good career. World champion, European champion, British Commonwealth champion, wins over David Haye, wins over Makabu, wins over Cleverly. They're probably his best wins. BJ Flores, and he's only been beat by Cleverly, a fight in which he avenged, and the 2 number 1s in the division at the time. Stevenson was number 1 at light heavyweight at that time, and Alexander Usyk, arguably the greatest cruiserweight of all time. So you can't really apart from the 1 loss he avenged, the only other 2 losses have been against the men on top of their division at the time. So you can't really say Bellew he overachieved. You know, he had good punching power, but it wasn't anything spectacular. You know, it was good, it was fair. But he didn't have crazy speed. He didn't have a crazy good chin. Didn't have a Floyd Mayweather defense. Didn't have Lomachenko footwork. But everything he had, he made work for him. He was a consummate professional. He was in the gym. He was always staying active. He was always trying to learn. So Bellew as a fighter, he has my respect. Certainly. I mean, you can't not look at his career and look back at the fights he's had and say, he did have some boring fights, but one that he had a boring career, he didn't. And that he didn't try his best to fight whoever he could. He certainly did. So, again, career-wise, I ain't got no issues with Tony Bellew's career. This was actually quite fun. Just looking at some of these fights and reliving some of them. It was actually quite fun actually having a look at it. That's Tony Bellew's career in a nutshell. I want to know in the comments what your thoughts are on it. You think that Bellew's career, do you like me think it was an overachiever? Or do you actually think that, no, there was more actually to Bellew than we think? And do you know what? It would have been interesting to see what would have happened had he stayed a cruiser and he not fought David Haye. I'd have picked him over Lebedev. I wouldn't. Obviously, we know what happened with Usyk. He wouldn't be Usyk. But I'd have picked him over Lebedev. Him against Briedis. That would have been interesting because Briedis was actually his mandatory. So when he went to fight David Haye, his mandatory was Myris Briedis, and Briedis actually fought on the undercard of BJ Flores versus Tony Bellew. He fought Simon Vallily. I wasn't impressed with. I've seen Briedis before, obviously, but in that particular fight, I wasn't impressed with him. And I kind of thought, like, looking back in hindsight now, if the fight had happened and had been in the UK, I probably would have edged Bellew to win that fight, to be honest with you. How would he have gone on against Gassiev? That would have been a hell of a fight. Oh, that would have been a great fight. How would he have got on against Dorticos? So many good fights would have been there at cruiserweight. I think he would have beat Bellew, might have beat Briedis. That power from Gassiev could have been a difference maker. It really could have. And the same with Dorticos. But would have been some great fights at, £200 for Tony Bellew. But that's his career in a nutshell. Let me know in the comments section what you think. Of course, as always, if you could, subscribe. Hit the like button if you haven't already. Thank you once again to the Hit Company, as always, for sponsoring these videos. It really does help. Helps me out a lot every single month. Thank you so much for it, my man. I'll leave you with that, people. Let me know who else you'd like me to talk about and do a review of their career, be it past or present. Let me know in the comments below. I hope you enjoyed it, people. Smash the like button as always. For now, I'll talk to you